Good evening, everyone. We are so happy that you're here to join us for this very special conversation, especially this being the 1st of May. It's actually perfect because we're kicking off Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and no better place to do it than here at the Asia Society. So thank you so much for your time. And I just want to say a few words about each of our speakers before we get into the discussion, just so you have a little more background on our esteemed speakers tonight. So first, Dr. Sue Varma here. She is one of the nation's foremost mental health authorities. She's truly a multi-dimensional expert. I've witnessed it up front myself. Not only is she an esteemed physician and board-certified psychiatrist practicing in Manhattan for over 20 years. I know, it looks like she couldn't have possibly been doing it for that long. But she specializes in cognitive behavioral therapy, psychopharmacology, and couples counseling. She's also a nationally acclaimed medical commentator, and she does breaking news documentaries. She's been a guest on our show, NBC News Daily, on the Today Show, on some of those other networks too that I'm not going to mention, but you know which ones they are. And I'm so excited because her book is here. She's going to be doing a signing, talking to folks after this event, so I highly recommend you stick around for a little bit to talk with Dr. Varma and pick up a copy for yourself if you haven't already, or for a friend. It's a great book full of practical tips for how we can boost our mood and our optimism, which has been linked to having longer, healthier lives and better relationships. It's just good all around. And for me, as a consumer investigative reporter, I always like people who can give you useful information, takeaways that you can apply in your life, and her book is chock full of those. And also, by the way, Publishers Weekly called it studded with catchy pearls of wisdom. This can-do guide uplifts. It is already on its way to being translated, by the way, into 9 languages and counting. So please welcome Dr. Sue Varma. And I'm also so excited because we have with us the esteemed Vice Admiral Vivek Murthy. He was confirmed by the U.S. Senate back in March of 2021 to serve as the 21st Surgeon General of the United States. He's really basically the top doctor in the nation. And actually, he was also the 19th U.S. Surgeon General, if you remember, under President Obama. Now, Dr. Murthy helps to advance the health and well-being of Americans, and he has also worked to address critical public health issues. He has issued Surgeon General advisories on the youth mental health crisis, as well as social media's impact on our youth. He's also spoken and been on the forefront of discussing the epidemic of loneliness that we're facing in this country, isolation. It's so ironic, right? We have all these social media apps, all these new technological ways for us to connect with each other, and yet Americans are reporting feeling more isolated and more lonely than ever. Why is that? We're going to get into that tonight. As Vice Admiral of the U.S. Public Health Service Commission Corps, Dr. Murthy also oversees more than 6,000 dedicated public health officers who are serving underserved and vulnerable populations. He was raised in Miami, which I didn't know, but welcome to D.C. That's a very different place, I think, than Miami, probably.
Very different,
yeah.
very different.
And by the way, he has a few credentials. He received his bachelor's degree from Harvard, his medical degree from Yale, and his master's in business administration from the Yale School of Management. Please welcome Dr. Murthy. Okay, so the first question is for both of you. I'd like to start with you, Dr. Varma, but let's talk about the mental health struggles that may specifically be facing the AAPI community. What are some of the disparities and needs, and what is it about, do you think, this community, which is both diverse and not monolithic and, and spread all across this country? What is it about these mental health struggles that you want people to recognize and not feel stigmatized talking about?
Thank you so much, Vicky, and thank you all for coming. I think this is the first step for us to take together as a community to prioritize our own mental wellness, to speak about it so that we take away the secrecy and the shame and the stigma. So as you had mentioned about the diversity, that's something that we really have to keep in mind. Often when research is done, it's unfortunate, a lot of the groups, the subgroups get lumped together. So we have the Korean American experience, Vietnamese experience, South Asian, and all very different. And what happens is, because we're lumping them together, they're not always getting the individual needs that they have. We know that Filipino Americans, for example, 78% of them say that we enjoy good mental health as compared to 46% of Chinese Americans. We know that 1/3 of Korean Americans experience depression as compared to 16% of Chinese Americans. So there really is a big difference. When we do the research, we have to make sure, are we asking the right questions? Because depression looks different in different communities. So the typical Western scale of depression asking about sleep and insomnia and concentration and low mood and impairment of functioning may not be the same in Asian Americans who may have more psychosomatic headaches, bowel complaints, and they may not have impairment in functioning because they may say, I don't have the luxury of sleeping in bed all day at 15 hours, telling their kid who says, Mom, Dad, I'm depressed. They may say, I came to this country with $7. What do you have to be depressed about, right? So depression may be experienced differently, it may be manifested differently, and we're not having the right instruments to pick it up. Then when I think about stigma, I think about the secrecy and the shame and the detriment of how we're not passing on the right information to the next generation. So when they go to their mental health checkups, the therapist or doctor may say, do you have a family history of depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, alcoholism? And they're literally giving you a blank stare because they're like, I don't know. We don't talk about that, the dirty laundry aspect. And then the third thing is the impact of discrimination and racism, which has been going on for many, many decades, years, centuries, but obviously the height of the pandemic and beyond. The problem is that we know that discrimination causes real stress in the body from head to toe, from depression and anxiety to cardiac problems. We know that even mothers who are carrying their offsprings end up having consequences as a result of discrimination. We see that the telomeres, the caps on the chromosomes, are shortened, and this is a reflection of oxidative stress. So all of this, in addition to language barriers, not having access, not having affordability to culturally competent, sensitive care, I mean, the list can go on, but there's a lot of barriers. And at the same time, we have a lot of needs. We're the fastest growing population in terms of like ethnic minorities. We right now are 25 million, soon to be 50 million in the next 25 years. And we have needs in the sense that the young population, when we look at 15 to 24-year-old, and I know that this is Dr. Murthy's specialty, the youth, young adult mental health, they have, number one leading cause of death is suicide, unfortunately. And when we look at Asian American male students, 9th to 12th grade, they are 30% more likely to have suicidal thoughts as compared to their peers who are white, non-Hispanic. So the needs are many, the barriers are many. And so this is what we're going to do, is chip away by understanding what the needs and how do we get culturally competent care to people who need it.
And Dr. Murthy, can you speak to that from kind of a public health policy perspective and your own experiences in the stories that people may be relating to you from our community?
Yes, well, I'm also just really thrilled to be here. I've been hearing about the Asian Society for a long time. This is my first time actually being here, so I'm really glad to be able to participate. And Dr. Varma and I have been able to do a few things together in the past, and I always just appreciate her wisdom and presence. I think that, like most people in the Asian American community, I've had my own experiences with mental health, struggling with my own mental health as a kid. And I still very distinctly remember that feeling of shame I had around my own struggles. I knew my parents loved me unconditionally, still do to this day, which I'm grateful for. I knew my sister did as well, yet I never talked to them about this, right? And why? It was because I felt like something was wrong with me, and I felt ashamed. So I now know something that I didn't know then, which was that I wasn't the only one feeling that way in the Asian American community, but many of my friends and and community members were as well. And I continue to hear these stories, as I travel around the country of people who are struggling, but they use different words to Dr. Varma's point, like the language, that people use may be different. I think that's part of the challenge here is if you don't know that language is different, and let's say you are a therapist who's not used to dealing or working with patients of Asian American origin, you may miss certain symptoms or real challenges there because people aren't using the same words. One of the cultural shifts that I often have found myself feeling that we need to make in the Asian American community and just more broadly is from seeing mental health struggles as a weakness to recognizing it can be our first step toward mental strength, right? Like if we can, just put it this way, if I came to my family early on and I said, I sprained my knee when I was playing basketball, but I really want to play more. They would say, well, you sprained your knee, so we've got to not only get your knee better, rest it, heal it, but we've got to make it stronger so you don't get injured in the future, right? So it turns out that injury can all be the first step on the road to actually even greater strength, right? We can actually think about mental health in a very similar way. Like we're all going to have moments where we struggle from time to time, but if we can see that not as a source of a weakness, not as evidence of a fatal flaw or irreversible flaw, but as an opportunity to actually make ourselves even stronger in some way, then I think that can fundamentally shift our approach to mental health. And that's part of the broader work we have to do, I think, in our community, is to make mental health part of health, make it no less important than physical health. And that doesn't happen because we, write an article or issue a bulletin. It happens most effectively, although this can be a part of it. It happens most importantly when people hear people who are like them speaking about mental health openly, talking about their journey, talking about what it was like to actually get help, and about how maybe it was different from the stereotype that they had of what therapy actually was. It's when we tell each other our stories that we can start to shift and change ourselves. And that's where I think we should think about who are the people, who can help shape those views for our community? Where do they gather? And if they are gathered in churches, in temples, in mosques, and in synagogues, if there are elders who we tend to respect more, if there are other people who are successful according to traditional standards, whoever they are, those are the people we should be encouraging and recruiting to speak up. And lastly, I think, look, while those people may be influential, the truth is when any of us speak up, it makes a difference. I had a mentor when I was in medical school who once said to me, at a time in my life when I was struggling to do something that I really believed in, but I was scared about whether I would fail in doing it. And she said to me, Vivek, remember that when you stand in strength, you allow others to see you and to join you. And that is true with mental health as well. Every time one person stands up and shares their story, however young or old they may be, however well-known or not they may be, they give permission to people around them that, hey, maybe I can share my story too. Maybe my struggles, aren't so unusual. Maybe it's not evidence something is wrong with me. So that is a movement we've got to build within our communities. It starts, in pairs of friends, in families, in local, faith organizations. But that's a journey that we've got to continue on. And if we do so, then I actually feel very optimistic that we can change our perception of mental health from being a source of weakness to a source of strength.
Dr. Murthy, if you don't mind going into it, I just read off your credentials, right? You went to Yale, you went to Harvard, you're now the top doctor in the nation, but you actually had some mental health struggles when you were younger, and you didn't talk to anybody about it. Yeah. How did you cope, and what would you do differently, now, knowing what you know now?
I didn't cope well with it, I think, because I didn't really know what to do. I thought, like in high school, I remember when I would struggle and I would have these pits sort of what I think now of, perhaps depression symptoms and such. I would just brood a lot at home. I'd withdraw. I wouldn't want to see other people. I would just wander outside, like in the neighborhood aimlessly, which actually was probably good for me to be outside in nature. That's actually helpful. But I really didn't know what to do. I remember some years later, when I was struggling again in the setting of a relationship breakup. I remember I was feeling really down and I wasn't sure what to do. And I remember thinking, should I go see a therapist? But then being scared about seeing a therapist, because I remember thinking, there are all these things out there that, if it's known that you're seeing a therapist, that might affect your ability to get a job, to work in this, field or that field or whatever it is. And all of these are myths, right? Right. But this is a long time ago, and I was like, wait, I don't want to do that. So I didn't end up really, following a path, of actually getting help. So I dealt very poorly, with it. The irony with all of this is I was actually really good at listening to friends who were struggling, right? So I was always there for them. I would always asking questions, showing up to support them, etc. Yet when it came to myself, I struggled to break through that barrier. I say that because you shouldn't assume because someone seems to be with it about mental health and open to conversations about it, that somehow they're cool with their own mental health, and with managing it, because that certainly wasn't the case for me. And lastly, I'll just say to your point, which you're very generous, Vicky, and sort of, what you said about my background and everything. But the one thing I think it's important is that I think one of the things that we have to do as a community is really come to terms with how we really define success, right? Because I think traditionally what we've done is we've said, you know what, success is getting a sort of high-ranking job. It's being well-known and famous, right? It's making a lot of money. It's occupying a position where you have a lot of power, right? So fame, fortune, power, academic accomplishment, like this is success, right? But I think the reason I think we want to be successful and that we want our kids to be successful is because we believe that it will make them happy, that it will create fulfillment. And there's nothing wrong with actually pursuing any of the things I just mentioned, right? I wouldn't change a lot about what I did, and I was really blessed with those opportunities. And to be honest, like we don't create these things by ourselves, right? We're the product of friends, family members who support us. Opportunities are given to us, teachers who we're lucky to be associated with and learn from, and I was no different. But I do think that the reality is that I know, and I suspect all of us know, plenty of people who have achieved in all of those categories and are profoundly unhappy. Oh. So I think what that tells us is that there's nothing wrong with pursuing those, but the problem is if you pursue those and think that that definition of success is going to create fulfillment, lasting fulfillment in your life, because it won't. There's actually a different triad that I think creates fulfillment for us, which is belonging, purpose, and service. Those three things, it turns out, and there's now good science behind this as well, those are the sources, the most enduring, lasting, sustainable, and deepest sources of happiness and fulfillment in our life. When we have relationships with one another, deeply fulfilling relationships, that is profound. That has a transformative effect on us. When we have a sense of purpose in our life, especially purpose that's connected to something that's bigger than us, right? That can drive us, in profound ways. And when we serve other people, the profound thing about service is you might think that sometimes if I'm struggling with my mental health, hey, I need people to help me. Why should I be helping other people? Well, it turns out that, as Dr. Varma knows and others who may be in the mental health field, that one of the challenges with depression is actually excessive rumination, right? It's like when you're constantly in your head mulling over everything that's happening to you in your life. And sometimes one of the most powerful things you can do to break that cycle is to focus on others. This is one of the reasons why service is one of the most powerful antidotes to isolation and loneliness. It's a very powerful salve, if you will, for mental health and well-being. So these three elements, belonging, purpose, and service, to me, this is the triad that constitutes success. When I think about my children who are 6 and 7 right now, and what I want for them out of life, sure, I would love for them to be, to have great academic success. I'd love for them to be, to have enough financial resources and not have to worry about anything. But what I now realize I want for them most of all is I want them to have deep and fulfilling relationships. I want them to have a sense of purpose that is connected to something bigger than them, that motivates them. And I want them to be of use and service to other people, whether it's 1 or 2 people or whether it's people at scale, because I know that that ultimately will be the key to their fulfillment.
I love that triad, belonging, purpose, service. Dr. Varma, Practical Optimism, that's the name of your book, and you help us with practical steps to achieve some of these things. Help us to reframe how we approach our definition of success and what we are striving for in life. How would we get to that triad?
Absolutely. And, I love everything that you said, Dr. Murthy, because purpose is the first pillar out of 8 pillars of practical optimism, of living an exceptionally well life. And to me, when I think about purpose, there's so much benefit. When you were sharing your story about depression, you didn't realize, but part of the treatment of depression is exactly what you did, which is connecting to other people, seeking social support, offering social support, and short-circuiting that cycle of rumination that becomes a slippery slope that each and every time it gets easier and easier to fall into a episode of depression. Having a strong sense of purpose in life, which comes through service, can increase or decrease your mortality in the short term and long run. We know that people who have a sense of purpose live on average 8.5 years longer. And people who have a sense of purpose are more likely to volunteer, and people who volunteer are more likely to have a sense of purpose in life. So purpose is really one way to extend your life. 2 hours a week of volunteering can reduce a risk of heart attacks, of strokes, you name it. The other thing is, of the 8 pillars, the other one that you mentioned is belonging. And when I think about our 3 basic human needs, autonomy, a sense of belonging, and a sense of competence. So having some freedom, some agency, some say in making choices in your life. Belonging, I feel like I matter. And in fact, when we see people who don't have a sense of belonging or don't feel a sense of mattering, they end up feeling like they're a burden. And then those are the thoughts that lead to suicidal thinking. So when you're connecting with other people, you are feeling as if I matter, right? Like even if you're not expressing yourself in that moment, somebody needs you, somebody finds value from what you shared with them, that they left feeling better, and you're like, all right, crap, I'm still stuck with my depression, but that person's happy, but I have a purpose. And that is an antidote to depression. And the other pillar, which is really important, is called processing emotions. And I think that a lot of times in the Asian American community, but really for anybody, I talk about in the book the history of emotions, that a lot of times people think of emotions as inconvenient, right? And in the French would look at emotions as passions. They're not anything that rational, logical people would do. The ancient Greeks found it very inconvenient, right? Stoicism and later on cognitive behavioral therapy comes from that idea of rational and logical is over here and emotions are over there. And I can see that in the Asian American community. Emotions are seen as being barriers to getting things done, right? So, oh, you're depressed, get out of bed, come on, you're being selfish, right? A lot of times we see like people with mental health disorders as they're just thinking about themselves, but really not understanding that they feel paralyzed in that moment. And in depression, in anxiety, your executive functioning, your logic, your reasoning, your ability to carry decisions out is hijacked. So you're not able to show up, and not because you're trying to be difficult or pain in anybody's butt, you simply can't. And so processing emotions, I like to give people lots of tangible tips, as Vicky said, and I shared this with her on the show. 4 simple things that you can remember today. When you're feeling down, name it, claim it, tame it, and reframe it. So this is something a tip and trick from cognitive behavioral therapy. Name the antecedent. What was the trigger? Claim it. Where in the body are you experiencing it? Because a lot of times people, and I talk about this very openly in my journey, in my blind spot, in my sort of breakdown, if you will, and, in the opening of the book about how I was experiencing physical symptoms. I couldn't walk. My mother was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. She was she wasn't able to get chemotherapy because she had underlying heart disease. And I was like, oh my God, she's going to die. So my brain is going to the worst case scenario. But here I am, I'm a 3rd-year resident. I'm working 100 hours a week between 5 different hospitals, sleep deprived, 36-hour shifts. And all of a sudden my legs give out, right? And so the body expresses what the mind cannot. Oftentimes we are being pulled, and especially coming from a South Asian background, I'm like, I have to help my family, right? And then being in medical school and residency, we put patients first. Everybody comes first, right? And what I learned through my own therapy is that we're not saying me first, right? We're just saying me too, that I get to have a seat at the table. So claim it. Where in the body are you feeling it? So for me, that would have been my legs, but tons of people have tension in their shoulders and they're clenching their jaws. And then taming it. So this is where journaling, helps. There's so much science behind 15 minutes of journaling a day. People who journal have recovery quicker from biopsies post-surgery. They have better recovery after stage 4 breast cancer in terms of quality of life. Like the list goes on of the benefits of journaling, right? It's not going to cure all your medical disorders, but it will certainly help in coping with them. And then the key part, so taming can be any number of things, journaling, deep breathing, meditation, and then reframing is the most important, which is something I learned from my work as a former 9/11 medical director. There was a program at NYU, and I was the first medical director, and attending, seeing patients who were first responders, both civilians and police and firefighters. And reframing was the most powerful tool. And sometimes something happens to us. And if we're talking about Asian Americans, we can talk about the refugee experience. And we have found that 75% of this population that was studied of South Asians had PTSD, South Asian refugees. So it's very common. The immigration experience itself can be traumatic for a lot of people, even if you don't have refugee background. But the reframing was very, very important in sometimes if it's a lighter trauma, so I separate trauma in terms of the big T traumas, the life-threatening events, and then the little t of trauma and the daily hassles of life. And reframing can help you in both. Sometimes it's about finding the silver lining, but sometimes there is no silver lining.
How do you reframe something?
So it's being able to spin it and say a couple of questions. What would I tell a friend? How am I going to look at this 5 years from now? Is there an alternative way for me to explain this? Is there any silver lining? Possibly. Some things are not going to be, and that's fine. You can move on. And what is the utility of me looking at something this way? So I would work with patients who were like, okay, we just had the worst terrorist attack in history. Like, there's no silver lining. And I'm like, 100%. But what is then the utility of feeling as if you can't leave your house, it's that the world is going to collapse? So like on some level, the utility might be protective, but if you're not leaving your house, as many of my patients couldn't take public transportation, they couldn't get on the subway. So there was no utility. And then the last thing I say to people, and this is something that the Eastern wisdom in my family passed down to me, is asking yourself one powerful question. Is this a problem to be solved or a truth to be accepted? And that's really important because sometimes, like when you're dealing with grief or loss, there is nothing to be solved, right? And so when you go through the 8 pillars, you'll see what step by step you'll learn how to problem solve, regulate emotions, practice healthy habits, develop deep and meaningful relationships. So it's really a 360 approach to life and wellness.
It's so much. I hope you're I always have to write things down when I hear Dr. Varma talking, Dr. Murthy as well. I want to sprinkle in a question that we got from the audience, and it's on my mind too. But, you think about the younger generations. They're very hip to the beat when we talk about mental health. They're like, yeah, this is it. I mean, I think therapy is in some ways trendy and trending, which is good. We're destigmatizing by talking about it. But how does the younger generation speak with the older generation about mental health, the need for therapy? That, it's very interesting that you said, actually, if your parent is experiencing stomach issues or they're, having physical manifestations, headaches and things, that might be a sign that they are struggling with mental health, even though it's a physical symptom.
Yes. So, starting with the primary care doctor's office is the best place because a lot of times people feel more comfortable looking at mental health, and it should be like created through the fold of primary care. So when you're going to your primary care doctor, asking that family member, hey, sometimes there's 2 questions. Have you lost pleasure and interest in the things that you once used to enjoy? Interesting. Well, and then the parent might say, well, I don't really enjoy a lot of things. And then it's like, okay, well, what's that about? Let's take a step back. Do you have hobbies, mom or dad? Oh, interesting. And then they may be like, well, I lost them raising you. And it's like, oh, a lot of anger. Noted that, right? Unprocessed emotion. Let's keep talking. And so sometimes you can look at their habits and you could say, I noticed that you watch, 15 hours of television. You isolate, you're not really out in the community. You don't belong to a community center. You don't have any friends. You're not volunteering. You stay home. Like, what's that about? And slowly introducing certain concepts to them about feelings. And like they do this sometimes with the pain chart, we're giving like little emojis. So how do you feel today? And what would it mean to express your feelings? And sometimes they may not say, the word sad, like in Hindi we say dukh, mujhe dukh hai, but like tell me more about that, and then share your own positive experiences to say, hey, first of all, mom and dad, like you don't have to go talking about your life and your childhood or say ill things about your parents, because I think a lot of like sort of what we have in our mind of Western psychotherapy is it's about you're going to be bashing the parent, and that's something that's not done in Indian culture, right? Like, or if the therapist says don't talk to your mom, you got to cut out that toxic relationship. That would never work, right? So that helping them find culturally sensitive, competent in their language with someone that looks like them, that sounds like them, but even starting with the primary care doctor, and sometimes I'm not a big fan of someone taking just medication for anxiety or depression and not having talk therapy as well, but it could be a starting point for some people who are like, nope, I will never talk about my feelings, but I'll take a pill. So I'm not opposed to that, but really, if you can have a thorough, at least one thorough like behavioral health session where you can talk about a little bit of everything, and then understand that if the person's like, nope, I will not talk about my childhood, because it's too painful for some people, right? To have to relive things where they're just like, it was 20 years ago, what's the point? And like there's a word bhagya and fate in like sort of Eastern concept of like this idea that this was my lot in life, right? Like you just have to accept. So I really do appreciate the acceptance concept, but let's not accept things without trying to maybe change them even a little bit to see if there's some room for improvement. And then asking people on a scale of 1 to 10, I'll often ask my patients if 10 is the best mood and 1 is the worst. So 10 is like you won the lottery. Where's your mood most days? And I hope that it's at least above a 5 or a 6. I mean, I'm happy if it's a 7 or an 8. But there's many ways to describe happiness and meaning, purpose, service, belonging that you talked about. And so, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. But talking about your own positive experiences and mainstreaming it into dinner time conversation. Oh my God, please pass me like the dal, the noodles, whatever it is that you're eating at home. And by the way, I went to therapy today. Can I tell you about it? And I've seen a lot of parents come along or maybe even involve them into your therapy. Would you mind coming with me just for one session? The therapist just wants to get some background. I don't really remember my grades in childhood. They want to know what kind of student I was. And then suddenly the parent is talking more in the therapy than you are. And you're like, be quiet, it's not your session, it's mine. You book a separate one. And do that. That might be one way.
Oh, that's great. That's a really interesting entry point. Dr. Murthy, let me ask you about this, because I also want to include the children who are experiencing this incredible technological revolution that we're going through now. You said your children are 6 and 7?
Yes. 6 and
Okay,
7.
so they're in it. They're in it. They're going to grow up and never have known a world without Instagram and TikTok and smartphones, right? So you put out an advisory last year about the effects of social media on youth mental health. Tell folks what you found and why it was so important for the U.S. Surgeon General to put an advisory out about social media.
Yeah, well, I think my guess is that almost everyone in this room has probably had their own struggles with social media. Actually, just by show of hands, how many people have struggled had a complicated relationship with your phone? Yeah?
Sure, for sure.
All right, so nearly all of us. And social media in particular, I think, is in many ways even more complicated for people. The reason I issued this advisory last year was because the most common question that I was getting from parents was about whether social media was safe for their kids. If you think about it, it's actually a very reasonable question, right? We assess the safety of plenty of things that our kids use, from food to car seats to toys, like you name it. Yet it turned out that there weren't readily available answers to their very reasonable questions. And so we set about putting this advisory together. And in doing so, there are two things that we found. One is there actually wasn't enough data to say that this was safe for our kids. In the same way that we assess plenty of other things like medications for their safety, et cetera, we had not demanded any of that safety data here for social media. And in fact, what was even more disturbing is that many of the researchers we talked to said that they were not able to get all of the information from companies that they needed to analyze and fully understand the safety impact on kids. So again, as a parent, I never want to feel like a manufacturer is hiding information from me about the effects of their products on my children, but yet that is how many parents are feeling. The second thing we found, though, is that there was growing evidence of harm that was accruing about the impact of social media on kids. In particular, we were finding that kids who spent on average of 3 hours or more on social media faced double the risk of anxiety and depression symptoms. We were finding that nearly half of adolescents were telling us on surveys that using social media was making them feel worse about their body image. And this is what adolescents are saying themselves, right? And like that, there were more and more findings that were concerning to us. I think there's a reasonable question that has been asked about, well, are there benefits, of social media use? And I think for some children, there are some benefits of social media use. Some kids can find that they can stay in touch with old friends, better. They might be able to find information or communities that they aren't readily available otherwise, on social media. I think the question we have to ask is, are the benefits worth the harms? And my worry is that for many kids, the answer is no. And the reason is I've probably at this point talked to thousands of kids, around the country on our tours and round tables, talked to many, many parents as well. And I just finished this college tour, for example, across the country and focused on loneliness and isolation. Yet the topic that came up from students in every single one of those campus visits was social media. They brought it up and talked about how it was off. And the three things they said most consistently is, makes me feel worse about myself because I'm constantly comparing myself to other people. Number two, it makes me actually feel worse about my friendships because I keep seeing my friends doing stuff without me and I feel left out. The third thing, perhaps just as disturbing, is they said they can't get off it. And it's not because somehow this current generation of young people are born with a deficiency in the willpower gene. It's because something is different in their environment, and specifically in their digital environment. These platforms are designed to maximize how much time people spend on them. And if you have the best product designers and engineers in the world using the most cutting edge behavioral science to design the tools that will keep you locked in and scrolling and clicking, how is an adolescent whose brain is still developing, where we know that that phase of brain development means that adolescents are more at risk and more susceptible to social comparison, to social suggestion, and they have less impulse control, how on earth are they supposed to succeed? Yet many kids and young people and college students I talked to felt guilty because they felt like they had done something wrong because they couldn't control and manage their use of social media. And you know who else felt guilty and terrible? Were their parents, right? Because the entire burden of managing these rapidly evolving platforms with harms that we're learning more and more about has fallen on the shoulders of parents, right? And one thing that's very interesting that I noticed is, see, my phone is in my pocket, right? And it's been buzzing here and there. And I can tell you almost with certainty that most of those buzzes have been text messages on the parent thread that for my kids' school. Because my kids are in kindergarten and second grade. There's a separate thread for each class, right? And I kid you not, there are probably 70 messages that get transacted every day for each class, right? So there's a lot of messages about all kinds of stuff. Hey, you know, is anybody selling Girl Scout cookies this week? Does anybody know when Spirit Day is next week? These are actually legitimate, good questions that you want to ask, right? And it's so easy. But I'll tell you what's never texted about on that group is about people's struggles with tech and their kids. Even though we know that parents are struggling with this, right? Like at play dates, we see parents battling with their kid on the iPad. No, I told you you can't play that. Why are you on that again? Except this is happening everywhere. But parents aren't talking about it as much. And there's a sense of shame, I think, that many of them feel. Like it seems like every other parent has figured this out. I must be the only one struggling. I must be doing something wrong. I'm not going to talk about this. So this has become a common struggle. And I'll lastly just say this. I'll just say, and we can talk about this more if you'd like, there are concrete things we can do, like as parents around this, which we should get to. But the last thing I'll just say for now is that I think that this is a problem that ultimately also requires a policy intervention. Like in the same way that when we had massive numbers of car accident-related deaths in the 1980s, we said, okay, we don't have to get rid of cars altogether. We don't have to just accept that all of these deaths are just a price of modernity. We can make cars safer. That's a third path we can go down. Here too, we have to make social media safer, right? But it's been around for 20 years, right? Congress has not passed any type of meaningful safety legislation that would put in place strong privacy and safety standards that would require the data transparency that we're talking about, that would limit or prohibit the use of features that would seek to manipulate our kids into excessive use, that would expose them to harmful content like extreme violence and other such content. Like that hasn't happened. And in my mind, that reflects a failure to deliver on our most sacred responsibility as a society, which is to protect our kids. And that's why we put out that report last year, and we've been continuing to beat the drum and call on legislators to actually pass real safety legislation. Because the truth is, all the moms and dads I've talked to around the country who are struggling with their kids' mental health and their social media use right now, the parents I've talked to who have lost their children to suicide after they were mercilessly bullied on social media, it's not comforting to them to know that legislation is being considered, that people are talking about ideas, that they're proposing bills. What they want to know, rightfully so, is when is something actually going to change in my child's experience? When is my life going to become easier in managing these tools? And that's what we fundamentally owe them.
Dr. Murthy told me he's met a lot of parents like me who I've kept she's 15 now, she has no social media. She's seen TikTok, she's seen Instagrams, she doesn't have her own account. And I don't know if I'm doing more harm than good. I think I'm not, which is why I've kept her off of it. And there's a movement that people are trying to keep kids off social media until they're 16 at least, and no smartphones in schools at all. We're actually we're doing a report on that for the Today Show. But Dr. Murthy said that he's never met anybody who said, I regret keeping my kid off social media, but he's met many who say, I regret letting them have it at 8, 10, 12. And that's really, if you're 10 and you don't have social media at this point, I feel like you're in the minority. So I guess the question here is, what is the right step for a parent to take? Is there an age cutoff, at least, where we can all try to hold strong as parents and community members to say, it's normal not to be on social media till you're 16. That's totally okay. Like, we don't give you a license till you're 16. But are there practical steps you recommend, Dr. Varma, about that? And you too, Dr. Murthy?
Yes. One thing that I got out of, we had the chance to spread the good work that you were doing about the advisory about a year ago. And what I got out of some of the reports and researches that your office had put together was, when you look at, let's say for teenage girls, and they're spending X amount of time, I think it was about 3.5 hours or more per day on social media, we saw higher rates of depression. And what they were linked to was a few key things. One is that they're not exercising, right? So the movement is less for boys and for girls. That the in-person sort of social connections there was a paucity of them. And in general, we know that high school students are spending on average 40 minutes or less per day in face-to-face interactions with their peers, right? And this is considerably down from 2.5 hours, let's say, 2 decades ago. So less in-person interactions. And then also the time sleeping is shortened to anywhere from 6 to 7 hours, when in reality we know they need anywhere from 8 to 10 or more. So when I'm thinking of, if somebody was like, oh, but how is my kid doing with social media? I think they're doing fine. I want to ask these 3 questions, right? Do you think that the time being spent is coming at the expense of in-person interactions? And my concern is when I'm seeing young people get together, is they're then on their phone together, looking at the TikTok or whatever it is. And so, look, there's pros and cons to that. One could say, well, it's no different than watching a movie, except for the fact that it's short form. You have 30 to 60 seconds.
You get popcorn brain.
Yes.
Somebody called it that.
Yes.
It made sense to me.
And the dopamine hits, and then you get used to a certain level, a threshold of excitement, and you need some form of a, quote, detox from it, where you're expecting, and look, for generations, we've always heard kids say, I'm bored. But I feel like my idea of boredom when I was growing up in the 80s is very different from their idea of boredom. Their boredom is, I haven't seen TikTok in the last 3 minutes, right? I haven't gotten a hit of dopamine and 1,700 ideas on YouTube, and then the kids are coming and they're like, oh, I need to buy this coconut oil because this is the trend that I saw, right? So for me, it would be those 3 questions, like, whether it's a certain amount of time, sure. I mean, I feel like different households have, whether it's 1 hour, whether it's 2 hours, but it's going to look at what is the impact, what are the detriments, and then can you really, like any good habit that you want to crowd out the bad habits, right? So like having things that are pleasurable. So like for my kids, it's like basketball and they love it. And I'm like, normally I would be like, it's a weekday, you should come home. And instead, I'm like, all right, sign up for all the teams, the games, the tournaments, because I know that when you're playing sports, yes, you're maybe not studying as many hours, but then you're out with people, you're staying active, and you're going to pass out and crash with good sleep when you come home because you've been so active all day. So crowding out the negative and giving them something worth doing. Because if somebody says, I'm home, and then that's the other thing. There was something I saw recently which I loved. It was talking about walkabilities, and communities that are walkable have higher rates of happiness. And when I think about that, what's interesting is that whether it's a community that's walkable, a suburban neighborhood, urban neighborhood, that once your kid is at a certain level of responsibility, then they can manage some of those, quote, play dates or hangouts with a little bit independence. It gives you freedom. Yes, you have to monitor and track, and we have, life tracking devices and apps, but then it gives them freedom to crowd out so that the option isn't either my mom has a play date for me or then I'm stuck at home watching 3.5 hours of internet.
It's more work managing their social media and making sure they're on it responsibly. I took the lazy way, which is like just say no to the whole thing. But that's not realistic for most people. And if people have kids that are already on it, or we're starting to feel addicted as adults, Dr. Murthy, how do you put the cat back in the bag? Can you?
Yeah, so a couple of things I'd say. So number one, first of all, I commend you what you did, Vicky, with your daughter. I mean, I know that it probably felt harrowing because the thing no parent wants to hear from their child is, everyone else is on it. If I can't be on it, then I'm going to be all alone. Is that what you want?
Right, yeah.
And then you're like, what am I supposed to do? As a parent,
totally.
right?
But I'm
That's
like, you have
hard.
me.
Yeah, there you go.
I'm right here.
I love that.
That's what she loves to hear too.
Awesome. But here's what I would say. I would say, number one, if your child is not yet on social media, I think the ideal thing to do is actually to delay the use of social media until after middle school, because that is the critical phase of brain development, social development, and early adolescence that we were describing earlier, when kids are particularly sensitive to social suggestion, to social comparison, and also where their impulse control is much less developed. Now, there's another thing I'm going to tell you to do as well, and then we'll talk about how to make this a bit easier. The second thing I would do is, if your child is already using social media, I would think about, along the lines very much of what Dr. Varma was saying, is protecting critical zones in their life for development by making those tech-free zones, right? So, and Dr. Varma mentioned a number of them, right? So sleep, in-person interaction, physical activity, and learning, right? These are 4 things that we know are critical for our development, yet our kids are using their phones in class, like a lot of them. Many of them are, a third of our kids are staying up until midnight or later on weeknights using their devices, a lot of that social media use. Many of them are using it while they're in person with other people, right, during meals and everything else. And they're taking it with them, everywhere, to the gym here or there, and who knows how that's compromising their activity. You can even start by picking one of those and saying, okay, you know what? as a family, maybe what we're going to do is an hour before we go to bed, everyone's going to charge their phones in the kitchen, and then we're going to go to bed. And then we get our phones back in the morning. And what that does is it protects not just quantity of sleep, but quality of sleep. And both of these are really important because when young people's sleep is compromised, either quality or quantity or both, that actually raises their risk of poor mental health outcomes, right? Sleep is very, very important for everyone, but for young people in particular. And what we know is that in addition to staying up late, that when a lot of people are sleeping with their phone right by them or in their bed with them, every time there's a notification, it vibrates, it disturbs their sleep. They get up to use the bathroom, to drink some water, and then before they come back to bed, they're looking at their phone, they happen to be scrolling through some text they got, and then it's harder to get back to sleep, right? So even if you start with one of those, right? Or even if you say, you know what, we're going to pick the in-person time, making that our tech-free zone. And when we get together for dinner, everyone's going to put their devices away. We're just going to look at each other, right? However you do it, like creating those tech-free zones is important. The last thing I'll tell you is like what we can do to make this a bit easier. One thing that's really important for our kids is to lead by example here. So, and this is the hard part. Like I told you about a lot of the feedback I got from young people on this college tour. What I didn't tell you is a lot of them complain about their parents and about how they're on their phone all the time.
Right, it's true.
And they can't get their attention.
We have to hold ourselves accountable as well.
Yeah, so we have to also realize, like, as one of my dear friends told me before we had our first child, he said, you know, your kids sometimes might listen to what you say, but they're more often listen to what you do. So be mindful of what you do, like, especially when you're around them. But the last thing to make this a bit easier is just to recognize that this is a pretty big lift, right? Like any of these steps. And doing it alone makes it an even bigger lift. But if a few of us were able to get together, if you were able to identify a couple of parents in your school community, or maybe a couple of neighbors who have similar age kids, or family friends in the community who you could come make a pact with between 2 or 3 families, then your child also knows that they're not the only one, and you have some support in getting through this and keeping yourself accountable, staying on track. Like if my children are, in a few years, if they say, hey, can we get a social media account because all the other kids have them? And I say, well, no, Vicky's daughter doesn't have social media, and you play with Vicky every weekend, see, and Sue's kids don't have social media. You see, like, you're hanging out with them, they're not using it. Then it just gives them at least a feeling that they're not alone. But let's just keep in mind, I want to reference something you and I talked about, behind, which is this, you expressed, I think, a very natural and understandable question, which is there any way in which I might be hurting my daughter if she's not the only one? If she's the only one who's not on social media. And I will say that in addition to what Vicky mentioned, which is that I have not met a parent who made that decision, who regretted it, but I've met plenty, who allow their kids to use it, who regretted it. What I'll also say is when I've talked to the young people themselves who have not been allowed to use social media, what's very interesting is many of them are resistant in the beginning, but about a year or so later, they thank their parents because they see what their peers are dealing with, how anxious they are all the time, how they're constantly worried about what people are saying about them online, how they look at what your peers are going through, and a lot of times they're like, glad I don't have that. Like I was in Colorado last year, I met a young woman who just graduated from college, and she told me that she wasn't on social media at all, and hadn't been until she said she made a decision with her parents when she was 12, that she was not going to be on social media. I said, well, what's it been like? She said, well, I had fewer friends probably. Friends meaning people that I knew what was going on in their lives, but they were really good friends. And we had a great community. And that has been echoed on this college tour I've been on, because a lot of the students who are struggling, they're not sure what to do, but they're starting to realize that they've got to start helping themselves. So there's a group of students who built something called the Log Off movement. And there are other movements like this that have started to help us, young people support each other as they reduce their time on social media or sometimes take clean breaks from social media. And I asked a number of them who had taken these breaks, I said, what was it like for you when you went 3 months without using social media? And here's what they said. They said, you know what? We found that we missed it a lot the first few days, but then we actually felt really peaceful. And one, we started caring less about what other people thought. We started focusing more on what we wanted. And again, just like the woman in Colorado told me, we had fewer people we stayed in touch with, but the people we stayed in touch with were really good friends. And we really enjoyed that. And they even described getting back, into social media as something that they felt like they didn't want to go back. even though like initially they were counting down the days, like, okay, it's going to be a 3-month break. How many days do I have left? Like a couple of weeks in, they're like, you know what, this is actually really nice. I really like this. But doing any of these changes in pairs, in trios, with other parents, with other kids, I think that's really the key to helping make it sustainable.
Terrific, thank you. And it's so interesting to hear that these are the conversations you're having with young people, the hip people. Before we go, and I know we're right there, but this is one more question from the audience for you, Sue. In the South Asian community, neurodivergence is too often under-discussed. Can you share thoughts on that issue and specifically how it's impacting South Asian youth? Because I do think that's really important. So if you can try to keep that to like 90 seconds, 2 minutes.
Yes.
And then, Dr. Murthy, I want you to just leave us with an uplifting message about how we can build social connection. Okay. You get to have some time to think about that. Go ahead, Dr. Varma.
So, again, like related to the stigma, I think that having psychoeducation around mental health disorders, neurodivergence, what it looks like, what are the symptoms, how it presents differently in different kids, and having it in the fold of schools and the psychoeducation and also in the pediatrician's office. So that really takes away the stigma. And I love it when I see behavioral health providers collaborating very closely with the pediatrician's office and asking pediatricians, who would you refer to, and then following through with the referral. Because a lot of times what I'm seeing is that things fall through the cracks because the parent will take the referral and then feel a lot of shame. What did I do wrong? They'll start to think about their pregnancy. Oh, I shouldn't have taken the Tylenol. I shouldn't have eaten. I shouldn't have gotten on that trip. So a lot of times moms especially, tend to internalize this shame and this guilt that there's something that I did wrong, or that the community will say, oh, it's because of how you look. Oh, I told my son not to marry you. I mean, all sorts of bizarre things, or you came from this family. I mean, I've heard every idea of because everyone is looking for a scapegoat, unfortunately, and had you eaten this, had you looked like this, had you come from this status of a family, I mean, the most bizarre things. Or I'll see some families say, like, we just need to pray about it. And, and I had a patient who, at the age of 7, they would take her to the temple and do all sorts of pujas. And then finally she came to me as an adult, but she was like, I was suffering, really badly with a variety of things. So I think understanding that there is no health without mental health, understanding that your brain is the CEO of your entire body, and whatever goals that you want to achieve in life, whether it's success, money, fame, all these things that we create to check the box, right? Mental health comes first. And through that, all sorts of success, sort of societally, ordained or otherwise, will come through it. So
that's great, Dr. Varma. Thank you. Yeah, making sure you advocate for your child and get that care. And then, Dr. Murthy, if you could, just what's something that you'd like us all to think about as we leave tonight in terms of creating social connection and moving this conversation about mental health forward?
Well, I think that one of the greatest things that we can do for our mental health and well-being is to invest in our relationships. It's to build social connection in our life. Most people don't realize that loneliness and isolation they're associated with pretty significant physical and mental health harms. But even more than that, it's a major contributor to so much of the sadness and despair that people feel today. I know there's a lot happening in the world, a lot of very difficult things happening in our country, really difficult things happening all around the world. And especially when we're hit with this 24/7, when we have headlines and news alerts and social media posts coming at us carrying these heavy headlines, it's hard not to feel pulled down by this, not to feel like you're despairing about the future. But despair is always multiplied when we feel alone, right? When we're together, when we feel like there are people who have our back, who we can lean on, then actually we feel much more optimistic and able to take on adversity even when it's there. And that's actually what we're called to do right now. We're faced with great adversity at a time where our social connections have frayed and have come apart. And that's a terrible combination. But we have the power to change that. The good news is we don't need an act of Congress to rebuild social connection in our lives. Thank God, because those will come very
it wouldn't happen. You wouldn't get it.
But what we can do, just very simple things today, is even just spending 15 minutes a day reaching out to someone you care about, checking in on a friend. Doing that consistently each day can make a world of difference in how connected you feel. Picking up the phone when somebody calls, I know that's like very 1990s, but actually, even if it'll take the same, even if you're like walking into an event, you're like, I don't have time to talk to them, but picking it up for 10 seconds to say, hey, Sue, I'm so excited to hear from you, but I can't talk right now. Is it okay if I call you back, a little later, maybe tomorrow? That 10 seconds of both of you hearing each other's voice makes a real difference compared to spending that same time texting the other person, right? And making sure that you're doing one small thing to help someone each day. It could be something really small, like you see somebody who's struggling with their groceries and you give them a hand. You see somebody who's lost in a street corner in New York and you give them directions. Or you find out that a friend is struggling and you show up just to listen, right? These are the small things that we can do that form the glue that holds us together. And the most important thing I want to leave you with is just a reminder that the most important ingredient we need to be able to forge those connections is not something we need to acquire or even get trained for. It's something we were born with, which is the capacity to be kind, to be compassionate, and to love one another. You know, when I think about the narrative about human beings today, it's often very negative. It's, oh, people feel like the world is more mean-spirited. People are looking out for themselves. They're often quite mean and harsh and cruel even to one another. But I think that's not fundamentally who we are. We all come into this world very different, like much more inclined toward love and kindness and compassion. And when I ever forget that, I just think about my own kids, you know, who are 6 and 7 years old. And I was sharing with a group earlier today that just one closing experience with my son that, you know, I hurt my shoulder. I have this frozen shoulder thing going on. And for any of you who ever experienced a frozen shoulder, you know that the one thing you're not supposed to do is make sudden movements, like with your hand, right? So my daughter at the dining table, she just tossed something at me being playful. And I instinctively just reached for it and then regretted it immediately because I felt this lancing pain through my shoulder. And it was actually so intense that I actually dropped to my knees. I was on the floor, like holding my shoulder with my eyes closed. And in that moment where I felt that searing pain and I was like trying to just squelch it out, I feel this small hand on my shoulder. I feel this small head lean against my head. And I open my eyes, and it's my 7-year-old son who has seen what happened, who got off his chair, and who came to comfort me. See, nobody taught him how to do that. He didn't go to a class on empathy training. He knew that because he came into this world like all of our kids with a natural inclination to love, to be kind. We need to nurture that within our kids. We need to express that within ourselves. We need to recognize that when we see that in other people. And if we do that, that's the foundation on which we will forge the kind of strong, healthy connections we need with one another. And if we build those connections, we will rebuild the foundation for society. Because everything else in our lives, our physical and mental health, the health of our institutions, the strength of society is built and predicated on how connected we are to one another. And that's what we have the opportunity to recreate.
How about that for a final thought? Dr. Murthy, Dr. Varma, what a pleasure. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was lovely to be in conversation with both of you. Dr. Murthy, I know you've got to get back to DC and continue traveling and doing the great work that you do. We appreciate you. Dr. Varma, we'll be back there, everybody, to sign the books and answer additional questions. So please go see Dr. Varma at the back, and thank you to all of you as well.